So, what is a computer? Let's first define what a computer is. A computer is an electronic device for storing and processing data, typically in binary form, according to the instructions given to it at a variable program or in a variable program. Now, that's only the straight definition of what a computer is. Now, a computer can do many things. It can be used for work, it can be used for entertainment, it can be used for school, many things. But let's first identify the parts of a computer and how does it work. First, you have the system unit, also known as the case or the chassis. This is what stores every single part of the computer. This normally contains the motherboard, the processor, the memory, the chips, the buses, the ports, the expansion slots, and cards. Now let's explain what the motherboard is. This is the motherboard. The main circuit board of a computer. It contains all the circuits and components that run the computer. So, things like the graphics card or RAM or the CPU will plug into this motherboard and send data throughout all the components of the computer. And most of the time, you would plug in your display or your peripherals through the motherboard. If you did not have a graphics card, you would plug in your display through the motherboard and you would use the CPU as your graphics. Well, what is a CPU? The CPU, or the central processing unit. The processor is the brain or heart of a computer system. It performs all of the instructions and the calculations that are needed and manages the flow of information through a computer. Now, things like information require storage. Where would you store said information? Well, you would store that in the primary storage. Or actually, not the primary storage, the permanent storage. Things like the HDD or the SSD. But let's first think about what the RAM is, or the random access memory. Now, there's many types of memory actually. There's ROM and RAM. The one I just mentioned was RAM, the random access memory. RAM is volatile, meaning it holds data only when the power is on. When the power is off, RAM's contents are lost. However, the ROM, or the read-only memory, such as the HDD or the SSD, is non-volatile, meaning it holds data even when the power is on or off. Now, the expansion bus. The expansion bus can also be called a PCI port or a PCIe port. Things like a graphics card or a SSD that is plugged in through PCI. Even a network card can be plugged into an expansion bus. A bus is a data pathway between several hardware components inside or outside a computer. It does not only connect the parts of the CPU to each other, but also links the CPU with other important hardware, as I just mentioned, the GPU, the CPU, a network card, or even an SSD. Adapters. Now, these PCI adapters are printed circuit board adapters, are also called interface cards, that enable the computer to use a peripheral device for which it does not have necessary connection or circuit boards. They are often used to permit upgrading to a new hardware. So something like the graphics card is an adapter, or a printed circuit board. Now, what powers everything? Of course, something has to power it. Something has to power all these components or hardware. Now, that would be the PSU, or the power supply unit. Installed in the back corner of the PC case, next to the motherboard, it converts 120 VAC or VAC standard house power into DC voltages that are used by the components of the PC. So, on the motherboard, there would be either a 8-pin CPU connector or a 24-pin connector for the motherboard to power it, and to power all the all the hardware connected to the CPU. Now let's explain what an HDD is. What's the meaning of an HDD? What does it do? Also known as a hard drive, is a magnetic storage device that is installed inside the computer. The hard drive is used as a permanent storage for data in a Windows computer. The hard drive is usually configured as the C drive and contains the operating system and applications. Now, there's a huge difference between an SSD and a HDD. Based on this alone, you can notice that the HDD and the SSD are bigger than each other. This is for one reason. The HDD uses a spinning disk drive that converts data that reads data off of a spinning disk. However, the SSD is a solid slate drive, meaning it only uses circuits and a cache to store data, which is why it's also faster than the HDD. Now those are all the parts of the computer. Now what do you use to actually see what you're using in a computer? That would be the monitor. And what do you use to control? The mouse and the keyboard. That's all the parts of the computer explained. That will be all for my project. Thank you very much.